Negritude movement is a movement which happened in France and during the war period. And it was again an experimental poetic movement during the interwar period in France. It was developed by the diaspora authors of African descent. So, African French authors who protested against the French colonial rule and the policy of assimilation. And the Negritude poets were mainly three poets: Leon Damas, who was from French Guiana, Aimé Césaire from Martinique, and Leopold Senghor, who was from Senegal. And they adopted modernist linguistic strategies, circulated their works first as typescript and then in small reviews and later into published collections. They mainly started by talking about aesthetics, poetics, and radical politics, which influenced by the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s in New York. The Harlem Renaissance had engaged with the issues of Black consciousness, about Black literary and aesthetic movement, and so the Negritude authors or poets were also influenced by the Harlem Renaissance, and they talked about Black poverty. They talked about racism. They talked about African American identity, or rather, the Negritudes were talking about their African French identities and the diasporic identities, and therefore how they were, what is their subjective position and how they have been treated, and so on. Um Damas had introduced Césaire and Senghor to the intellectuals of the Harlem Renaissance, and he wrote a volume of verse which was called Pigments, and pigments as in the color. Yeah, the manifesto of the Negritude movement was written there, and he raised the issue of how the Eurocentric epistemology and methodology in the interpretation of Negritude aesthetics. So, how, the whole idea behind assimilation, the European assimilation, and therefore the blacks were losing their own roots, their own culture, their own literature, and therefore the blacks needed to be able to, they needed to go back to their culture. And Damas was actually a mixed heritage, a mulatto, and therefore he had a major problem because there was a double consciousness in his work, because he was both, he was in the middle of a black and a white, and therefore there was a very deep discursive double consciousness working in his mind, and he was constantly talking about his position, subject position, and the consciousness of a black man in Europe. Aimé Césaire was a prolific writer who wrote 7 volumes of lyric verse, wrote many plays and essays and so on. Some of them have been given here: Discourse on Colonialism, Letter to Maurice Thorez. And Césaire's double consciousness, his struggle to reconcile his Frenchness with his Africanness, play out in his politics also. He is a militant poet, but his radical politics, is mainly through his poetry and not in engaging as an activist. He is not an activist, but he was mainly a poet who was trying to bring. So, you know, uh, I have not written down, but maybe I can just read out one poem by Damas, which might help us to understand the kind of language, the staccato rhythm, and the imagery that was used. So there is a poem, a very short passage I'll read out. It says, "How many of me have died since then, since they came that night when the tom rolled from rhythms, the frenzy of eyes, the frenzy of hands, the frenzy of statue, feet," and so on. So it's like that, very staccato rhythm, small verses, and it kind of it kind of underlines important words, and the importance of what it is, to have this kind of a consciousness, and how the kind of intersubjectivities that they talk about. Senghor, Negritude is a rebellious affirmation of his African identity, going back to the roots in the face of assimilation, where you are given as a diaspora, you are made into assimilated into the French culture. And therefore, Senghor constantly talked about the Africanness and the roots of slavery, the roots of colonialism and racism. And during the Second World War, he joined the service of French army, and later on he wrote very many volumes of verses which were very well acclaimed poetry, came out in anthology. Sartre's essay Black Orpheus, published as a preface to Senghor's anthology of poems, labeled Negritude movement as an anti-racist racism. It is seen as race essentialist and particularistic. So Sartre was talking about it from an existential and philosophical kind of thing, and he was talking about this subjectivity based upon how one is located within one's own racist subjectivity, and it is, this versus that othering. But Franz Fanon in Black Skin, White Mask actually argues or criticizes Sartre, although he is also influenced by Sartre, but he criticizes him by saying that the whites for the blacks are not just the other, but they are also the masters, because they are also, whether real or imaginary, and therefore the power struggle that is there is has to be understood. It cannot be this versus that or the othering of it only, you know so, in conclusion, I would say that while Anglo American modernism often wanted to escape history through aesthetics, black writers actually tried to challenge colonial history through creation of a different representation. So, black writers, for instance, they went back to their oral poems, oral poetry, the tradition of oral poetry. And therefore, the staccato rhythms that you find, the beating, there is a particular way, the stylistic way, which goes back to the African culture, the African literature. And of course it also talks about displacement, otherness, contradiction, and so on. Henry Louis Gates points out that modernism was actually a mulatto movement in which newness came in art and culture through syncretism and fusion. So when we started by talking about modernism has often been called as a very white, heterosexist, European upper class art. Uh, to a largely yes, but of course there are also other kinds of modernism that we find through the Negritude movement, or let's say the agrarians and others who were also trying to talk about different kinds of they were trying to talk about their subjectivities from different perspectives. So I think in all we need to understand that literary modernism is not a very unified movement, unified homogeneous movement, and therefore there are various schools, there are various trends, there are various movements, and set of concerns are more or less same, but ultimately the way in which they are expressed, the form through which they are expressed is very different. Joyce once has written, I'll just end with this quote of Joyce, where James Joyce had once written that the important thing is not what we write, but how we write. And in my opinion, the modern writer must be an adventurer after all, above all, willing to take every risk and be prepared to founder if is in his effort, if need be. So he ends by, so this is the quote of Joyce, where he is trying to talk about this idea of how it is not important what we are writing, because the the crisis is the same, and how one responds to that crisis is what we are looking at, yeah, through different artistic expressions. Thank you, that will be all. These are some of the books that you can look at. I hope it made sense. I did rush a bit at the end, but because I thought, we are moving beyond time, but I hope it's okay. Sir, is it okay? Any questions?
Bound, man. Good afternoon, ma'am. Thank you for your lecture. I'm sure the participants have. This has been we were enjoying your lecture. This has been a very good lecture as usual. We savor each and every lecture of yours, and it is difficult to get you, but this time we are happy that we got you twice. Looking forward again to get you in the near future. May I request the participants, if you have any question, please raise. I can just unmute you and you can directly ask a question. The participants if you are not willing to chat, just there is somebody called Lori Nazad. Yes, you can unmute. Yes.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you.
Hmm.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yeah, you
Yes,
are
you
audible.
are.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much, ma'am, for such a precise and compact lecture. It was pleasant listening to you. And among all the terms that you discussed today, one of the terms which I'm very fond of in the modernism is that of apocalyptic. Because in midst of all the chaos, as it believed in the restoration of goodness, which is something that is very important for us to understand in our lives.
We lost you.
Am I audible now?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. So, ma'am, concerned with apocalyptic, I have just two questions out of curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, as you discussed that one of the characteristics of the apocalyptics was that they imposed order in their poetry. But if we see the overall characteristics of the modernist poetry, then we see that they have followed the free verse, and there is a fluidity in approach. So, other than the disillusionment caused by the Second World War, which you discussed as one of the failures behind the apocalyptic approach, could this be considered as one of the reasons behind its failure?
Yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe it is. It could be seen as. I think the order was mostly to talk about the verse form, because they were actually going back to they were going back to what they call the neo romantics or humanist philosophy, and they were trying to impose an order through iambic tetrameter form, and instead of using verse lever. So yes, you're right. Like while T.S. Eliot and others would be using verse lever and free verse, and therefore talking about the. So here, I think this going back and this constant urge to have some kind of an order and going back to the myth, for instance, mythification. I think it could be seen as contradictory to their idea of freedom from the social and political, social and political chaos that was happening. On one hand, they are trying to move away from the apocalypse, were trying to move away from social criticism, political criticism, and were directly reacting to Auden kind of poems, Shabod and Auden's kind of poetry. So yes, maybe they are trying to, on one hand, they are trying to break free and move away into talking about their self exploration and so on, but at the same time they're trying to, the verse that they use, the form that they use is very, with iambic tetrameter and all that, going back to that earlier kind of 18th century kind of verse form.
Okay.
So yeah, you're right
Okay.
that it might be one of the reasons why it didn't really work for too long. Also, I think it's
Okay.
it's mostly the apocalypse didn't work because this disillusionment which came. It was this
Hmm.
idea after the First World War that that whatever has happened just once and it could never happen again, and let's go forward with whatever, let's impose a new order because the order has broken down and it is a fragmented world, but through art we can impose some kind of order, because art is, and the artists were seen to be intellectuals, the artists were seen to be almost like figures, prophet figures, seers and prophets. So therefore, but this did not last after the Second World War. After the Second World War, they realized that things are not what they were. It's not just one off thing. This could happen, and this has happened again. And now everything that they had, so they were completely disillusioned. All the hopes that they had of restoring the world order, that didn't work out. So I think that was the main concern. That was the main reason why the apocalyptic poets did not fare well. for a very long time.
Okay, thank you so much, ma'am. And ma'am, as one of the visions of the apocalyptics was the vision of something new. So I want to ask that in the post Second World, in the after the post Second World War, like if we talk about all the movements which have taken after the Second World War, among all those movements, can we consider or can we see from that approach, from that apocalyptic approach, any movement which has denoted a kind of sense of revival of that apocalyptic approach, that there should be the restoration of goodness, and we should not look at the negative approach towards an age which was, despite it was filled with wars, but still there should be the vision of that new, that restoration of goodness.
I can't think of any. I'm sure there would be poets who would be writing about such, but I don't know whether any such movement as such came out. I can't think of anything which has come. The one would be the existentialist kind of thing where you just give up. But going back and having a restoration, I'm not very sure whether we could see that approach in. I can't at least remember right now,
All
but
right.
I'd be happy to go back and check again.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much for the questions.
Thank you, ma'am. Any other questions, please? All right. So with that, we come to the end of thoroughly enriching and engrossing lecture. We enjoyed this lecture very much, ma'am, and hope to see you again on this platform in the near future. On behalf
Thank you.
of DAATH VOYAGE, thank you so much. Please take care and
Thank
see you
you.
soon again. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you. Please take care and stay safe, all of you.
Same to you, ma'am. Thank you.
Bye.